You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge. Witness the strength. Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Terrorize the jam like troops in Pakistan.
Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Quick service announcement brought to you in part by Warriors.
Damn, that shit was dope.
And welcome back to another Warrior Creed live stream with me, the Radical Majid Nawaz. And today's topic and title screen should be on your screens right about now. You should be able to see a wanted poster for Benjamin Netanyahu. The topic for today's stream headline there, as you see it, is Netanyahu is becoming increasingly globally isolated as President Trump is losing patience and the UK, France, and Canada threaten sanctions against Israel. That's the latest. Those of you who regularly follow our stream will remember from last week, we discussed Trump's whirlwind tour through the Gulf in the Middle East, speaking in particular with Saudi Crown Prince and de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and how any preconditions for normalization with Saudi Arabia and peace with Israel are now separated. There is no longer a condition for normalization with Saudi Arabia that Saudi recognize Israel. Likewise with peace with Iran. Trump had already decided to forge ahead in the Middle East without Netanyahu by his side. And today's stream is going to demonstrate how increasingly the Americans are losing patience. They are catching up with their European allies who've already lost patience. And let's begin with this, what you see on your screens now. That's from 20 days after the false flag October the 7th operation, which was a Hamas attack, but was facilitated by Netanyahu himself as the head of Israel's own domestic intelligence, Ronen Bar of the Shin Bet, has himself insinuated and as a result resigned in disgust. We said there 20 days after the October the 7th attacks, Netanyahu is about to overplay his hand tonight. What that looks like is this Times headline today. And this is from the Times of London today, the 20th of May, reading from the headline, Trump's patience is wearing thin. Netanyahu risks global isolation. And the subheading is, amid warnings from allies and domestic unrest, the Israeli leader is testing the limits of his support as US president grows restless with the war in Gaza. And to read an extract from that article for you, that's on your screens now. The Times reports 20th of May, 2025. The president seemed genuinely concerned at the plight of the Palestinians in the territory. Sources familiar with his conversations during the tour said he had also grown increasingly impatient with Netanyahu, who he didn't even like, which is a quote there in the Times, one source emphasized, and who has made a career of running circles around US presidents since Bill Clinton. Trump is not like his predecessors, and world leaders have learned to tread carefully around the mercurial president who can turn on a dime if sufficiently cajoled by a confidant or a friend. That is in today's Times about Trump losing patience. But as you regulars will know, we have been arguing this is a long time coming. Netanyahu had already overplayed his hand and he's facing increasing international isolation. One of the consequences of Trump losing patience was what we discussed in last week's stream, and that is the president of the United States of America forging ahead with peace with Iran, a ceasefire with the Yemeni Houthis in Yemen, which is the Iranian-backed militia, and normalization with Saudi Arabia, who in turn, the Saudis and the Iranians having made peace also with each other. The Middle East is moving ahead, and the Gulf Arabs, crucially, with their oil and their wealth, are forging ahead side by side with President Trump, minus Netanyahu. That's one consequence of Trump losing patience. Another consequence is what's on your screens now, a scoop by Axios dated the 19th of May. JD Vance, the US vice president, considered traveling to Israel tomorrow, which would have been today, but decided against it due to the expansion of Israel's military operation in Gaza. That's consequence, again, of Trump losing. To read from the Axios that we've just cited there, Vice President JD Vance considered traveling to Israel on Tuesday, but decided against it due to the expansion of Israel's military operation in Gaza, a senior U.S. official told Axios. The U.S. official said Vance made the decision because he didn't want his trip to suggest the Trump administration endorsed the Israeli decision to launch a massive operation at a time when the U.S. is pushing for a ceasefire and a hostage deal. So the Americans are focused on a ceasefire and a hostage deal. The Gulf Arabs and the Persians are focused on peace and with each other and with the Americans and stability in the region and trade. And Netanyahu is focused on doing whatever he can to provoke World War III abroad and to turn increasingly against his own domestic population, as best symbolized by the dramatic resignation of Israel's head of internal security, Ronen Bar of the Shin Bet, in a blame game against Netanyahu for holding him responsible for having facilitated October the 7th by Hamas. That's so far so good with the Americans, the Gulf Arabs, and the Iranians. But now also today's headlines report that the Europeans and the Canadians are losing patience, as represented here in this Times headline from today. UK, France, and Canada warn of sanctions for Israel over Gaza suffering. The UK, the French, and the Canadians are now officially warning Israel of sanctions. The subheadings: Sir Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and Mark Carney urge Benjamin Netanyahu to stop military operations, allow humanitarian aid into Strip, and engage with the UN. Now, it's worth noting that this decision or threat of sanctions by the UK, France, and Canada sits above the pay grades of Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and Carney of Canada. Now, that may sound strange because those three I named are the respective leaders of those three countries. However, when it comes to matters of foreign policy, in particular towards Israel, there requires by definition to have been a broader consensus before a leader such as Sir Keir Starmer can make such a threat against Netanyahu, because, of course, Netanyahu has a great deal of compromise on these world leaders, particularly people such as, through the Epstein operation, which is a known Mossad operation. One wonders what Netanyahu has on people such as Lord Peter Mandelson, our current UK ambassador to the US, only recently appointed by Keir Starmer, despite the fact that Lord Mandelson has been a frequent visitor to Epstein's Island and even went to Paris with Epstein for his birthday after the latter's conviction. This is a sort of leverage through the known Mossad operation, which was the Epstein operation. This is a sort of leverage that Netanyahu has had at his disposal up until now in order to cajole, blackmail, and control world leaders. Well, clearly something is afoot, because that no longer seems to be working, as the UK, France, and Canada warn of sanctions for Israel over Gaza suffering. That's the Times headline today. That clearly means and indicates quite strongly that a decision has been taken above the pay grade of Sir Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and Mark Carney to warn Netanyahu that he better get his act together. To read from that article in the Times today, the extract should be on your screens about now. Sir Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and Mark Carney have warned that the human suffering in Gaza is intolerable and said that Israel is at risk of breaching international law. In a joint statement on Monday, the leaders, which is yesterday, the leaders of Britain, France, and Canada told Israel that it faced sanctions and said the announcement that a basic quantity of food would enter Gaza was wholly inadequate. They called on Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, to stop military operations and immediately allow humanitarian aid into the region. So here now we witness a scenario in which, according to the scoop by Axios, the vice president of the US has just cancelled his trip to Israel. The UK, France, and Canada are threatening sanctions against Israel. And now add to the mix China, which, according to reports, has accused Israel of war crimes and has been demanding a global investigation at the ongoing ICJ, International Court of Justice, hearing. And all of this points to the fact that indeed Netanyahu is becoming increasingly isolated on the stage by his so-called allies, the world leaders, who are beginning to lose patience because public opinion is rapidly turning against Israel under Netanyahu. As Glenn Greenwald has recently noted, a new Gallup survey, just to read from Mr. Greenwald's post, support for Israel among Americans is at its lowest level in more than 25 years of polling history on this question. Less than half of Americans now support Israel, with support for Palestinians increasing, largely due to Biden's funding of Israel's war. That's Greenwald reporting there, but we're going to show you the headline from Gallup themselves. This is the Gallup poll. This is the Gallup survey that Greenwald just referenced. You can see it there on your screens. Less than half in US now sympathetic toward Israelis. Subheading, support for establishment of independent Palestinian state remains at majority level. Did you catch that? Support for establishment of independent Palestinian state remains at majority level. And that's why we put it to you that the world leaders, a decision having been made above their pay grade, are now turning on Netanyahu and are no longer able, he is no longer able to control them through his compromising information operations because something higher than these world leaders' own fears of their own exposure is in charge, and public opinion leaves no option for these leaders. To continue reading from that Gallup poll that we just cited you, 6th of March 2025, Gallup reports, although Americans remain more likely to say their sympathies in the Middle East situation are with the Israelis rather than the Palestinians, the 46% expressing support for Israel is the lowest in 25 years of Gallup's annual tracking of this measure on its World Affairs Survey. The previous 51% low point in this trend of American sympathy for Israelis was recorded both last year and in 2001. You see there? Do you notice that what it means is that support for Israel is on a downward trajectory like this? And the last two examples were last year's was previously its lowest. It's now this year is the lowest. Last year was previously its lowest. And before that, 2001 was its lowest. But it's plummeting. It's going downwards. Meanwhile, as Gallup surveys report, support for the Palestinians is on the rise. We can see that in the second half of this quote. At the same time, the 33% of US adults who now say they sympathize with the Palestinians is up 6 percentage points from last year and the highest reading by 2 points. And what that looks like in Gallup's own published graph is this. You can see that's a graph headlined American Sympathies in the Middle East Situation 2001 to 2025. And you can see the drop in support for Israel. And the problem here, of course, is that's going to pose a problem for a politician that seeks to have a broad center ground support base coming into elections, or in the case of President Trump, already elected, somebody who appealed to that non-partisan anti-war support base, which was outside of what he himself dubbed were the rhinos, or the Republican in name only. Trump's votes existed largely outside of the establishment Republican consensus. So he would be very interested in this recent Gallup survey, as would all UK politicians going into the next general election, whenever that may be, because the center ground are where it matters. And of course, with the images of starving children coming out of Gaza, it's going to be increasingly difficult for that center ground to remain uncritically pro-Netanyahu. And this is why now the UK, France, and Canada are threatening sanctions. Keir Starmer, along with other gestures towards politicians such as Nigel Farage, leader of the Reform Party, promising a number of other things, such as curbs on immigration, some trans-identifying women from entering female-only shortlists due to a recent High Court ruling. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, is very quickly seeing the writing on the wall and is making about turns on a number of issues to make sure that he of his own base. On this Palestine question, keep in mind that the largest swing against Labour in the last elections were heavily, the largest swing against the left-wing Labour Party were in heavily Muslim majority voting areas. Keir Starmer is going to be very sensitive to this Palestine question because his own health secretary, Wes Streeting MP, won for Labour in a seat in London's Ilford with only 500 votes between him and second place, who was an independent candidate, the British Palestinian Liane Mohammed, without even a large political party or an establishment party backing her. This independent candidate came within only 500 votes of the current Labour Minister or Secretary of Health, Wes Streeting. So that exemplifies, and by the way, that close shave for Labour when it came to hemorrhaging votes on the Palestine issue in Muslim majority constituencies was replicated across the country, which is why Keir Starmer is in trouble. But it's not just the UK, France, or Canada. As we said, Trump himself is losing patience, as represented not just by the Gallup survey, nor his cancelling of his visit for his Vice President JD Vance to Israel, nor his forging ahead with the Gulf Arabs and with Iran for peace deals without Netanyahu's consent or involvement. But in addition, because the chattering classes in DC are also beginning to rapidly turn on Israel. The Hill is a publication that pretty much sums up gossip in DC. And these sorts of articles in The Hill, yes, it's an opinion, but these sorts of headlines in the Hill opinion are indicative of the climate that we are saying has now pervaded Western capitals. Netanyahu is not America's ally, and Trump finally knows it. To read from that particular Hill opinion piece, you're going to begin to get a gist of how rapidly opinion is turning against Netanyahu, who has overplayed his hand, as we said he would, only 20 days after the October the 7th false flag facilitated by Netanyahu and conducted by the terrorist organization Hamas. So here is an extract from the Hill article dated 18th of May 2025 from the Hill opinion. Anti-Semitism is real. It is ugly, persistent, and absolutely worth condemning at every turn. But criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu, the man, the politician, the schemer, is not anti-Semitism. It's realism, and it's long overdue. So when Donald Trump bypassed Israel on his recent Middle East tour, choosing instead to shake hands in Riyadh and Doha while skipping Tel Aviv altogether, it wasn't hatred. It wasn't betrayal. It was distance. It was pragmatism. It was a reminder that the US is the superpower, not a client state, not a donor, not a servant. And it doesn't need to stop in Tel Aviv to make that point. The distance says something the political class in America has been afraid to utter for far too long. Benjamin Netanyahu is no friend of the US. He may call himself an ally. He may speak before Congress. He may wrap himself in shared values and talk about Western civilization. But strip away the optics and you're left with a man desperately clinging to power, willing to endanger global stability, fan the flames of war, and burn bridges with the very country he pretends to revere, if it means keeping himself out of a jail cell. It's quite damning what the Hill opinion has published on Netanyahu. That, keep in mind, the Hill, a reference to Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., it's indicative, we would argue, of a rapid turning of opinion in DC circles against Israel, led by Netanyahu. And of course, we already knew this was coming, as we reported last week in Warrior Creed and in the Radical Dispatch from the Middle East Eye on the 13th of May 2025. Some of Trump's closest media allies, like Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson, have stepped up their criticism of Israel's occupation of the occupied West Bank and war on Gaza in a way that would have been unimaginable for the allies of a Republican president 2 decades ago. Astute political operators sense changes in the air. We received close to $4 billion for arms. I think we'll have to wean ourselves off of American security aid, just as we weaned ourselves off of American economic aid, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Sunday, in a potential nod to the growing power of Trump whisperers who want the US to focus on spending at home, not abroad. Even Netanyahu is realizing that he cannot guarantee US security spending on Israeli military and defense budgets. And he's openly beginning to say it because the tables are turning and the tide is turning. Even headlines such as this, which we showed you last week from the New York Times, again, opinion, but Tom Friedman is pretty much a reliable barometer for establishment opinion in New York circles. And here again, Friedman writing for the New York Times, this Israeli government is not our ally. Very similar, if you notice, that from May the 9th to the headline in The Hill from Washington, D.C. Netanyahu is not America's ally, and Trump finally knows it from a week later. And you begin to see a pattern because the tide is rapidly beginning to turn, and Netanyahu knows it too. He knows he may not have too long left to survive either. And so he's playing every hand he's got. And one of them, and the reason why a lot of people are upset with him, is, as the Times reports, you can see on your screens now, Israel vows to take control of Gaza before unprecedented attack. Netanyahu's reaction to all of this is to threaten to recolonize and occupy Gaza. The subheading from that Times article, Benjamin Netanyahu said that he would be allowed Benjamin Netanyahu said aid would be allowed into the Gaza Strip after an 11-week blockade following global pressure to prevent famine for Palestinians. And just to read another extract for you about Netanyahu's response to all of this criticism being to invade Gaza, here you can see again from the Times reporting today, 20th of May, the US is pushing to accept a compromise mediated by Qatar. The talks so far have failed. Sheikh Mohammed ibn Abdul Rahman ibn Jassim al-Thani, the Gulf country's prime minister, said on Tuesday, warning that the Israeli operation was undermining any chance of peace. Israeli media has been replete with claims that Trump is reaching a breaking point with Netanyahu after months of unflinching support. First, he blindsided Israel by announcing talks with Iran and then a ceasefire with the Houthis. His envoy, Steve Witkoff, was reported to have accused Israel of prolonging the war. You can see the Americans wanting to mediate peace via Qatar, pressuring Netanyahu to do so, but and working behind Netanyahu's back to do so with the Houthis in Yemen and with the Iranians, but Netanyahu so far remaining intransigent. But other countries are beginning to lose patience. The Times again reporting today, to quote from the article, but the US, as well as Britain, France, and Canada, the three countries that threatened Israel with the sanctions on Monday if the operation continued, are aware of statements by Netanyahu and some of his ministers that the operation, named Gideon's Chariots, could aim at destroying any remaining buildings in the territory of Gaza to encourage the residents to leave once and for all. Gaza will be totally destroyed, Bezalel Smotrich, the far-right finance minister, said. This might be messaging to assuage the government's hardline support base, but it feeds into accusations by Israel's opponents that it is seeking to ethnically cleanse the territory, something Israel has denied. Israel is on the way to becoming a pariah state, like South Africa was, if we don't return to acting like a sane country, said Yair Golan, the leader of the Israeli Democrats, expressing widespread fears among the opposition in the country. Even domestically, Netanyahu's opposition know what's going on. The writing is on the wall, but this man, Smotrich, Netanyahu's finance minister, representing the hardline far-right faction of pro-violent warmongering settlers, extremists, Israeli terrorist extremists inside Israel, those who terrorize Palestinian villagers by literally occupying and settling illegally their land, Netanyahu is unfortunately beholden to them. And as you can see now, as the Haaretz itself reports, Finance Minister Smotrich, we are destroying everything that remains in Gaza, and the world isn't going to stop us, he said. to read from the Times on what Smotrich has been saying, dated the 5th of May, 2025. Some Israelis have already stopped reporting for duty, many citing burnout and others explicitly saying they do not agree with the continuation of fighting. The families call it the Smotrich-Netanyahu plan, a reference to the hardline finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich. He openly said on Monday that the government had agreed for Israel to stay in the Gaza Strip and not leave, even in exchange for hostages. We are finally going to occupy the Gaza Strip, he told a conference in Jerusalem. We will stop being afraid of the word occupation. Smotrich is backed by extremist Israeli settlers who believe Gaza should be reoccupied by Jews. Israel withdrew its forces and citizens in the unilateral 2005 disengagement under Ariel Sharon, then Prime Minister, leading to elections in Gaza and a violent takeover by Hamas. Once we occupy and remain in the Gaza Strip, we can start talking about sovereignty, Smotrich said. And there you have it. Netanyahu's reaction to the increasing global isolation is beholden to his finance minister, hard, far-right extremist Smotrich. His reaction has been to Nation Gideon's chariot, reoccupy, recolonize all of Gaza. And we have a video of Smotrich saying that patient is fine, and that's what we're going to do.
עזה, לכבוש אותה כפי שהבטיח לנו הרמטכ"ל הנוכחי כשנכנס לתפקידו על דעת כן, ולא לפחד, כן, לכבוש את רצועת עזה, להקים בממשל צבאי, לקחת להם שטח, לממש את תוכניתו של הנשיא טראמפ, ולהוציא 1.5 מיליון, 2 מיליון עזתים מעזה. יש שיח מאוד מעמיק, וצריך אגב להשקיע בזה ולעבוד בזה, כדי לייצר אלטרנטיבות של מדינות אחרות. אין ברירה אלא לעשות את זה כאן ועכשיו.
ואם לא יסתדר, זה כולל גיוס מילואים?
אם אתה עולה...
Now, we'll place all these receipts in the Radical Dispatch tomorrow for you, as usual, which is the written version of this stream. But in the meanwhile, that was Smotrich threatening the occupation of all of Gaza, and the UK, France, and Canada, having lost patience, put out this statement. As the Times reports, 20th of May, in their statement, Starmer, Macron, and Carney said, "We strongly oppose the expansion of Israel's military operations in Gaza. The level of human suffering in Gaza is intolerable. Yesterday's announcement that Israel will allow a basic quantity of food into Gaza is wholly inadequate. We call on the Israeli government to stop its military operations in Gaza and immediately allow humanitarian aid to enter Gaza." If you go down to the second paragraph, it states there that they also condemn the abhorrent language used by Netanyahu's ministers. That's a reference to Smotrich when it says there, abhorrent language. Now, Netanyahu has responded to the UK, France, and Canada's threat of sanctions with the following, which is on your screens, should be on your screens about now. And this is on his Twitter profile. Netanyahu posted the following by asking Israel to end a defensive war for our survival before Hamas terrorists on our border are destroyed, and by demanding a Palestinian state. The leaders in London, Ottawa, and Paris are offering a huge prize for the genocidal attack on Israel on October the 7th, while inviting more such atrocities. So there you see Netanyahu doubling down, calling it at the bottom there, this is a war of civilization over barbarism. Israel will continue to defend itself by just means until total victory is achieved. Netanyahu doubling down, of course, in complete denial that the world already knows that his crutch that he's using of the October the 7th attacks were facilitated by him. Yes, they were conducted by Hamas, but Hamas, in particular, the Patsy, Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of the attack, who was an Israeli asset, Hamas was facilitated by the Likudnik Zionists led by Netanyahu to engage in this attack so that Netanyahu could have the pretext for war. So doubling down on this October the 7th attack narrative isn't going to do Netanyahu many favors. The Times reports that the US is continuing the pressure. You can see there the US is pressuring both sides to accept a compromise in talks mediated by Qatar. Now, the important thing here is go to the writing in bold. This is what the Sheikh Mohammed ibn Abdurrahman ibn Jassim al-Thani has said about what's causing the holdup in the peace negotiations. It's the writing in bold there. He says one party is looking for a partial deal that might lead to a comprehensive deal, and the other party is looking just for a one-off deal and to end the war and to get all the hostages out. We couldn't bridge this fundamental gap. Now, in other words, the reason the stalling is that Netanyahu's probably saying, we're not going to promise anything about your future security in Gaza. In fact, they're already outside of these negotiations, saying that they're going to occupy Gaza. And meanwhile, those that are negotiating on behalf of Gaza are probably saying, hey, we need some form of guarantee if we release all these hostages that we're going to get what we're asking for, which is peace, prosperity, stability, a Palestinian state, not continued forever and indefinite occupation. And that's where the negotiations mediated by Qatar with the support of Trump and the US seem to have been stalled. The Hill, again, reporting on the 18th of May, there you can see them blaming Netanyahu for the stalling. It says there very clearly, the US is not a client state, not a donor, not a servant, and it doesn't need to stop in Tel Aviv to make the point. Netanyahu is no friend of the US. The stalling that is being all sides now, the Qataris, the Americans, the UK, France, Canada, the Chinese, all blaming Netanyahu. The stalling is what's causing the plummeting of goodwill for Netanyahu, just as we said would happen in last week's Radical Dispatch. Headline, Trump visits Saudi Arabia and freezes out Israel for normalization with Arabs. We mentioned that was going to be happening last week. We've been saying it for a long time. Netanyahu is going to overplay his hand. There is a roadmap for peace. If Netanyahu can be forced, can be cajoled and pressured to comply with the following, this is how you get peace. As the Times reports, on the 12th of May, Netanyahu's office said it was still prepared to accept the so-called Witkoff proposal, through which Hamas agrees to release half of the hostages up front in exchange for a week-long truce during which the sides agreed to hold talks on the terms of a permanent end to the war. Go down to the second half in bold. Hamas has insisted on ironclad guarantees, such as a UN Security Council resolution, in order to ensure that Israel holds those talks and agrees to an end to the war. In addition to releasing the hostages, Israel is demanding that Hamas dismantle its governing and military capabilities, while the group has said it is prepared to forego control of the Gaza Strip to an independent committee of Palestinian technocrats. It has held off on the demand to permanently disarm. Now, as we said in last week's Radical Dispatch, that detail there in the Times from the 12th of May does provide a glimpse into a potential roadmap for peace. We mentioned this in last week's dispatch. It's on your screens now. This is essentially a roadmap for peace in Gaza. This is effectively the Northern Ireland model, which culminated in the Good Friday Agreement between the IRA and the UK state. The IRA agreed to a ceasefire, after which its political wing, Sinn Féin, was elected to civilian power. Once Sinn Féin was in government, the IRA began to slowly disarm. If above reports are true, Hamas has expressed willingness to hand over power to Palestinian technocrats. The fact that the state of Qatar acted as an intermediary here has precedence. It was that same state of Qatar that mediated between the Americans and the Taliban over the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, ending the neocon war there too. So that Friday model is the way forward. It would involve Israel accepting and for Hamas ceding control, that Palestinian technocrats come to power in Gaza. Israel does not occupy Gaza, and Hamas agrees to cede power, but doesn't necessarily disarm until a series of subsequent milestones, as happened in the Good Friday Agreement. The civilian government, the Palestinian technocrats, are put in place. They manage, the Palestinian technocrat, the disarming of Hamas over a phased process. You don't just unilaterally disarm a militia. Everybody who remembers the experience in Iraq knows what happens when the US coalition unilaterally disbanded the Iraqi military. They ended up becoming ISIS. And they realized in hindsight that that was a huge mistake. So the roadmap to peace looks like the Good Friday Agreement, but in the context of a broader regional, grand regional settlement for peace, as we've been elucidating on for a long time here at Radical Media. That's the only way it will work, with a regional context and a very specific context. And this model we did elaborate on in the Warrior Creed stream last week. And just as a little reminder, here we are saying this as well. But the IRA only agreed to disarm over a series of subsequent negotiations. And of course, that led to the great peace deal, the Good Friday Agreement, and the end of the conflict in Northern Ireland, which nobody, if you check public opinion in Ireland or Northern Ireland or the United Kingdom, wants to see a return to. So there is a model that could be used for the removal of Hamas from power in Gaza, the agreement to allowing a Sinn Féin equivalent, a different civilian authority, such as the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas, to come into power, to retain control of the Gaza Strip, and in return, Hamas agrees to a permanent ceasefire, and Netanyahu likewise agrees. Now, there is, of course, a plan B. If Netanyahu continues to behave in the way that he is, the plan B would be, as Jerusalem Post reports, the following. Gulf diplomatic sources debate if Trump will announce U.S. recognition of Palestinian state. The plan B is that Trump loses patience completely and does what Spain has already done, and that is simply recognize a Palestinian state. To read from that, dated the 10th of May from the Jerusalem Post, Saudi Arabia will host a Gulf US summit. That's, of course, happened last week. Speculation swirls over a major announcement on a Palestinian state and peaceful US-Saudi nuclear cooperations. Numerous predictions regarding the announcement that Trump referred to, describing it as a very important announcement during a meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at the White House on Tuesday, May the 6th. Go down to the second half there in bold again. President Donald Trump will issue a declaration regarding the state of Palestine and American recognition of it, and there will be the establishment of a Palestinian state without the presence of Hamas, the source added. If an announcement of American recognition of the state of Palestine is made, it will be the most important declaration that will change the balance of power in the Middle East, and more countries will join the Abraham Accords. So that hasn't happened yet, but it is a plan B, continued intransigence. Now, what Trump did do after unilaterally negotiating peace terms with the Houthis, he went on also to then negotiate the peace with Iran. Those two processes are in place. He then went on to recognize the new government of Syria. That is also something that he did without consulting with Netanyahu. The former Al-Qaeda commander, formerly known as al-Jolani, now President Ahmed al-Sharaa, has been brought into the cold, and sanctions on Syria that have been in place since 1979 have been lifted. So you can see the region is moving on. And there's a danger for Netanyahu that Trump will continue with that momentum and recognize a Palestinian state, regardless of Netanyahu being on board or not. Either way, the writing is on the wall. And as we said on the 27th of October, only 20 days, original October the 7th attacks, 27th of October 2023, Netanyahu is about to overplay, and that is indeed what seems to be happening. That's all we've got time for this week's Warrior Creed live stream. We will be back next week as usual for Warrior Creed. As always, version of this stream will be published tomorrow with all the receipts that you heard today. And we ask you, premium subscribers of the Radical Dispatch, because then you gain access to the behind the paywall content, including the podcast version of Warrior Creed and other exclusive announcements and opportunities, and content is available. We cannot do this work without your premium subscriptions on Radical Media, and we thank you for your support. That's all for now. You've been listening to Warrior Creed with me, the Radical Majid Nawaz.
You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge. Witness the strength of street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Terrorize the jam like troops in Pakistan.
Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
service announcement brought to you in part by Warriors.